card. So there's a box over there, and you can take 1 or 2 or 3, whatever you want. Okay, here we go. All right. So yeah, as Andy was saying, I've been at the Wildflower Center for I'm just days away from my 28th anniversary at the Wildflower Center, 28th year. And I've been up until September, I've been the director of horticulture for the last 21 years. So I've been around for a while. And it's been really fun to see the organization grow, and I've been able to grow my career along with that. So wonderful there. Let's see. Oops. Okay. Like so many of us who are lucky enough to be nannied by the great outdoors, I felt a deep belonging and centeredness in the rural Michigan woods surrounding the trailer park where I spent summers in my early years. Here began my connection with the natural world, observing a walking stick insect while surveying a maple tree trunk, collecting a rainbow of leaves from those same maples come fall, pushing a finger into the earth-scented, spongy, moist moss that our neighbors complained about invading their lawn, and eating huckleberry pie baked by my dad from fruits that my friends and I so proudly and competitively foraged. My father introduced me to my first wildflower guide, and I was astonished that there were such things as wild onions and that you could eat them, although I don't actually really like them. Aftertaste that lasts forever. So that was a little snippet from the preface from the Texas Native Plant Primer. I just wanted to say that Timber Press approached us back in 2019 to do a Texas Native Plant Primer, a gardening book for Texas Native plants, because Texas is so big, we got the whole state. And being the director of horticulture at the time, it was obvious for me to take on that project, and I was very willing and excited to do that. Yeah, so the book came out in March of this year. Let's see.
The page down or arrow down is probably easier than the mouse.
Yeah, it's not
working.
I think the mouse, I just have to be sensitive here. Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share some of my life experiences, collecting information from fellow designers, horticulturists, environmentalists, ecologists. And, I learned so much from so many people that I really appreciate being able to take that work that I've done to accumulate that information and share it with other people and try to get people inspired to take on gardening with native plants or doing restoration projects or whatever. And so that's a really important thing for me to be able to do. And so, as I mentioned, we signed the contract in 2019, and it just came out in March. So that's how long it took to get that baby processed. And I also, I think it's pretty interesting to combine horticulture, like the horticulture is a really nice balance between science and art and intellectual endeavors and aesthetic endeavors, inside, outside. It's just a really wonderful balance of different kinds of experiences. And it's been really wonderful to be inspired by Mrs. Johnson. Actually, these are a little bit out of order than I thought. So let me tell you a little bit about the Wildflower Center. How many of y'all have been to the Wildflower Center? I guess a lot of y'all would be. So this is not going to be news to most of you that we are all about supporting the conservation of native plants wherever they are. But for the purposes of the actual organization, the physical botanical garden, we're collecting plants from the state of Texas, which we've had lots of debates over the years about whether the political boundaries make sense or if we should do it according to ecoregions or vegetational regions, but it's an easier way to explain it to people. So that's what we're doing in our gardens, and that's what the ranges of the book. We are, as many public gardens are, we are very much interested in education, although I think most people who come to visit are really about seeing the gardens and looking at plants and the beauty of them. But we're also trying to educate people about, the importance of native plants, inspiring the conservation of natives, We are part of the University of Texas at Austin, and we are considered an organized research unit and also a field station at the university. And then in addition to our public gardens, we have about 9 acres of cultivated garden space. And then we also have a 16-acre native plant or native tree arboretum. And then we have the rest of the site, the rest of the 284 acres is natural areas that we are doing research on, and also land management, and trying to reduce the amount of invasive species primarily, but also doing some restoration on the project too, or on the land as well. And we have a fairly robust science and plant conservation program, which we're doing research, and we're doing analyses of the I think it's been like 23, 24-year study that we've been doing on how the different land management can affect the vegetation. We do vegetation surveys twice a year to document what the plants are and how they're changing according to different kinds of management techniques, including fire and mowing and control. And then we also do environmental education. Obviously, people think about for little kids. We have lots of school groups coming out, but we also do adult education. We have a very robust slate of classes that we offer. And we also do professional things too, like, we'll have conferences and symposia at the Wildflower Center, including the spring symposium that we do with Native Plant Society every year. Okay, this is the person that I was saying that I've been very inspired by over the years. And when I first started working at the Wildflower Center, let's see, I have a quote here that I wanted to read to you. Next page. This is also in the book, but I think this is a really important sentiment that she says. Very wise woman. My hope for what lies ahead in the field of landscape design is not a revolution against the use of non-natives, but a resolution to educate ourselves about what has worked for Mother Nature through the ebb and flow of time, and to put that knowledge to work in the planned landscapes that are everywhere a part of our lives. And another important thing is that she really inspired, I've lost my place here. Yeah, okay. I think this is the next picture. This is also a very important sentiment to me too. And a big reason why I was inspired to use native plants is that I wanted Texas to look like Texas and Vermont to look like Vermont. And this is another thing that she proposes, which is wherever I go in America, I like it when the land speaks its own language in its own regional accent. And I used to practice that with her nice Southern drawl, but I'm not going to subject you to that. I never really pulled that off. Okay, so I wanted to introduce you to some of the elements that are actually in the book. This is the table of contents. And in the introduction section, we cover things like what is a native plant and why it's important to grow them. So let's start with that. What is a native plant? Well, you're all here, we're members of the Native Plant Society. And what does that actually mean? And I find when I'm talking to people that there's a big discrepancy of what people think a native plant is. And it's a complicated topic and it depends on where you are. But this is a summary or a little shorthand that I think works fairly well, which is a plant that occurs naturally where it evolved. Of course, it's not tidy either, because we know that with every generation, there's evolution that's happening. So it's not that cut and dry. But, if you're talking about not over tens of years or dozens of years, but over millennia, I think that that works fairly well for us here. It's also really important to consider the vegetation areas, when you're to consider geography, when you're talking about native plants to somebody, say you're at a garden center and you're buying plants for your garden and you want to have native plants. If you just say, I'm looking for plants that are native, are you talking about native to the United States? Maybe they'll give you Joe Pye weed, which may or may not do well in your garden. Or you can see that even Texas is a very large state with lots of different areas to it that grow different kinds of plants. I mean, there's a lot of overlap too. But really, if you're trying to do a restoration, you're probably going to want to be very specific and maybe only take plants that are local to your drainage area, for example, Or if you're really concerned mostly about gardening with plants that are drought resistant, then maybe you're going to lean more towards things that go to the west. So really, how you define the geographic range has to do so much with what your goals are for your project. So just keeping that in mind. And then why is it important to use native plants? One of the main things that people are using native plants for is for being drought resistant, which is a really important, here in Bernie, Central Texas, water resources are very limited, and it's not going to get any better, with less rain, climate change, but also population increases. It's going to be really important that we are preserving our water. Also providing habitat for wildlife. I love this picture of the robin juggling a yopon berry. If you're using native plants and have a diversity of native species, you're more likely to attract a diversity of wildlife to your garden as well. Avoiding the introduction of invasive non-native plants is also a really big deal. If you have invasive species that can really outcompete your native plants, that's really, I've heard some people say, well, that just adds to it. It's an additive thing that having introduced species just makes more diversity. But what happens a lot of the time when they actually become overly prolific is that they squeeze out our natural vegetation and ultimately reduce the amount of diversity that we have. And that's sort of by nature of it being invasive. So that's a really important thing for us to be respectful of. Sometimes people want to just put lots and lots of compost in their garden. If you're trying to grow tomato plants, that's great. But if you're using locally adapted native plants and you've done some homework and you know what plants are going to do well in your spot, you really don't have to go through all that trouble. Depending, if you have actually native soil. Now, if you have builder's fill, that's, the sandy loam, the red death, then maybe you have a different situation. But if you're using native plants in your native habitat and the native soils, you really don't have to do much for soil amendments. And I always say amendments with air quotes because amending something implies that there's something wrong with it. And there's nothing wrong with our native soil. You just have to find the plants that want to grow in it. I also love to brag that at the Wildflower Center, we don't fertilize our gardens. Rarely do we do that. And the plants just do their thing. They're programmed to bloom and be healthy. If there's something that's really struggling for some reason, maybe someone stepped on it or a deer ate it or something, then we might, give it a little nudge with some fertilizer, but rarely. And then we've also talked about the water use already. Disease and pest resistance is another important one. That's not to say that we wouldn't have invasive pathogens or pests that come in, but if you're having native pests, attacking your native plants, those plants are adapted to that and are more likely to survive that without a lot of heavy-handed chemicals and intervention on your part. And then I would also say that preserving regional identity and botanical heritage is a really important thing too. It's like ecological patriotism. And I would also just add, really native plants are cool. And that seems like an obvious thing to say, but I used to work at a native plant nursery in Austin at Barton Springs Nursery, and I had a customer come in once, and he was looking for plants for his project, and he's started out right from the beginning saying, I don't want any of those native plants. I'm like, I don't even know what that means. So I proceeded to show him things that I thought would work in his project and didn't tell him whether they were native or not. And he left very happy with a lot of native plants. So yes, native plants are cool, whether you know it or not. Oh, and look how cool they are. I mean, that's just stunning. I love that. Okay, then moving on to using native plants in the garden and how to use the book to help with that. The book goes into talking more about ecoregions and understanding garden ecology and habitats, that sort of thing, and a lot of the basic things that you would expect: how to grow the plants, the maintenance issues, growing conditions, range, habitat, that sort of thing. So I'm going to focus here a little bit more just because I can't tell you everything in the book. I can't tell you how the book ends, right? I don't want to destroy the plot. So I'm going to focus just really a little bit more on design and less so on the other things because you can look that up pretty easily in the book. So I'm going to have you indulge me in a little exercise here. So closing your eyes or whatever, imagine what a native plant garden looks like. And you all might have, an image or two, a couple things in mind. Um, and maybe it looks something like this, where you have, nice wildflower meadow with the standing cypress, horse mint, some brown-eyed Susans. And this is certainly something that would work. This is a garden, actually, even though it looks very wild. In order to maintain that kind of display, you need to continuously disturb the soils and remove the woody plants, perhaps, or maybe the grasses. If you have some grasses, they might want to try to take over. You might need to actually weed out non-native species or things that you don't want. So that's a garden, right? And maybe it looks something like that, more perennials and more woody plants. That's also a lovely native plant garden. So a lot of the time we're thinking of things that are looking fairly naturalistic. But I think it's really important. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my tenure at the Wildflower Center is to really present different styles to people. Not everybody wants to have a wild looking garden. A lot of people assume that a native plant garden is going to be messy, and it certainly can be, but it doesn't have to be. And you can use native plants in a garden like this with formal elements. Using things like geometry. We have the whole bed is a square, and then there's a circle lawn, and then there's the crisscross of the pathways in the middle. So there's some geometry. It's very symmetrical, mirror image on either side. The way the plants are sheared and trimmed, that's also going to make it look a little bit more on the formal side. So it's not the plants themselves that dictate the style of a garden. It's how you design the space. And as a horticulturist, I will say a huge piece of that is in your maintenance and how you garden it. And if your gardener and the designer are not the same person, they better be talking, because the gardener has so much influence over time and what that garden's going to look like. And if they're not maintaining that space and gardening that space according to the plan, it's going to start shifting into something different. This is more of a traditional looking design. And I think of gardens as being not naturalistic or formal or stylized. I think of it more as a continuum or even a matrix, right? So you might have elements that make it look more one style than the other. This looks a little bit more traditional with the urn, but it also has some formal elements to it, like the geometry and the symmetry to it as well. And one of the things that I hear people say that I really want to challenge, that I've heard people say, well, a formal garden has more structure, and that doesn't fly with me. I think any well-designed garden is going to have good structure, regardless of whether it's a naturalistic space or formal space, or something else, some more stylized thing. So it's really important to realize that. So I think it's also interesting to think about, your garden doesn't always have to look very tidy, but you can keep it more tidy. And we admire plants that are very easy to grow and don't take a lot of maintenance, but you still have to garden to make a garden look like a garden, right? That's called gardening. And there's another example of some nice garden design. You can't just plant plants and then walk away and just say, oh, they're going to look great forever. You have to do maintenance, even though they're native plants. Even if you want it to look very naturalistic, you can do some shaping and gardening, with a light touch, but you probably are still going to have to weed stuff out and maybe trim things and shape them a little bit to make it look make it legible as a garden. Now, at the Wildflower Center, it's funny because we'll have guests come through and they'll get all the way through the woodland garden, and they'll ask one of the horticulture staff and like, where are the gardens? And well, you've been through like a third of them already. But it doesn't really matter whether people understand it as a garden as much as it's important important that they appreciate it as a beautiful space, right? So we can call it a garden, but really the main thing is that people are having a good time. Here we have some stock tanks that are reflecting the ranching style of the Wildflower Center, the structure, a lot of the corrugated metal that's on the buildings. But it also allows us to have some topography in an otherwise flat space in the theme gardens here, which I didn't think about at the time, but when we put this in, our volunteers were really happy because they don't have to stoop over as much. They're elevated beds, but also, it's easier to decide what needs to be in there and what shouldn't be, what should or shouldn't be in there, because, there might be one or two, maybe three species in each of those planters. So it makes it a little bit more obvious what needs to happen in those beds too. And this is what the space looks like. Filled in. Basically, they're just container gardeners, right? Instead of having clay pots, we just have a larger scale container there. Excuse me. This is a picture that I really enjoy showing folks. We had a couple different bonsai exhibits at the Wildflower Center where we worked with the Austin and San Antonio chapters of their bonsai societies. And they just selected species that were native to Texas and we put them on display at the Wildflower Center. And, I would talk to guests and they would be just really amazed that, oh, you can bonsai native plants. I'm like, yeah, you can torture natives too. Course you can. And there were some great examples. There's cedar elms. There was uh, actually one of my favorites was a Mustang grape that was mostly dead, and it just had this long, crusty thing, and then some leaves on the end. Then there were hackberry and bald cypress. Ironwood was another one, so that was fun. Okay, so in the entries for each of the plants, I also include information about combinations of plants, like things that do well together, that look good together, but also have similar growing conditions. So here's some examples of, some things that thrive together. And then I have what I like to tell people is a magic trick. And this is what I call time sharing. And the idea here is to put two different species in the same location in a garden. And so the idea is that you'll have a warm season plant mixed with a cool season species. So take the two examples on the left side of the screen. So you have your Texas lantana, which is actively growing through the warm season, blooms throughout the summer. And then the first hard freeze just, withers to brown leaves and looks not very interesting. But around that time is when the pink evening primrose will start growing, and it'll have a nice blanket of green throughout the wintertime, and then they'll bloom in the springtime. And then about the time they're done blooming and they start looking pretty tired and ratty is when the Texas lantana will start to leaf back out and take over the show. So they're time sharing, they're trading seasons. And both of those species are also pretty aggressive, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend pink evening primrose in particular for an average garden bed. But if you're trying to just do some landscaping in an area where it's really tough, those are really great plants, and they're both pushy and they'll just kind of duke it out, right, and make it work. The combination on the right is another classic combination that you'll see in nature, which is the cool season species of the giant spiderwort, which has leaves that look a lot like a daylily throughout the winter. They bloom in the spring with these beautiful purple flowers, but also within a single stand, you'll have white flowers and lavender and pink and blue. And that sometimes is really fun, is to just see all the colors that you'll have in a stand of the giant spiderwort. And then they completely melt and disappear. And I have people say, oh, what's wrong with my spiderwort? It's turned yellow and it's dead. And oh no, it will be back. As soon as we start getting some rain again in the fall, it'll resprout again for the spring. So you want to combine that with something that's going to be actively growing through the warm season. So the wax mallow or Turk's cap is a perfect pairing with that because it grows and blooms all summer, and then it freezes to the ground, and then the spiderwort starts to take over. So that's how the idea works. This is what it looks like in action. Now, these are old pictures, forgive me, but it's one of the best examples of images that I have of comparing seasons. So on the left side of the screen, you'll see what that garden looks like in the spring, or used to look like in the spring, with the pinky wing primrose. There's paintbrush, some bluebonnets. There's some native ranunculus, the large buttercup. And that looks great in the spring, very colorful. And then if you look at the picture on the right, all of the plants that are that you see in that image are still in the ground on the image on the left. They're just expressing themselves in a different season. So you have the pink Gulf muley, the Indian grass in the back, the prairie goldenrod along the front. There's also the nodding fleabane, that actually is the fleabane's in both pictures, but that'll bloom spring and fall. Anyway, so it's a really easy way, at the Wildflower Center, we're not doing bedding plants, we're not putting in geraniums and impatiens at different seasons. And so we have to be really careful and thoughtful about how we combine things so that we have a continuation of flowering to keep it interesting for us and our guests, but also our animal guests too, right? So this allows us to have a richer habitat throughout the seasons, where the pollinators and other animals can have as much food, nectar, pollen, whatever, throughout the seasons. Also, it's less work because you're not having to replant every season. It's less resource intensive. We're not having black plastic pots to throw away, or the transportation costs, the carbon footprint that takes. The peat moss that might be in the potting mix that you're getting from the nurseries. So all of those things, this is just a more sustainable way to do it anyway, all the way around. And it's fun. It's a magic trick. Incidentally, I think it's also really interesting to think about why the plants are blooming, right? The plants are blooming because they're trying to attract pollinators. And it's really just sort of incidental that we as people find the flowers beautiful. The plants really don't care if we like them or not. They don't care anything about us. They're all interested in getting pollinated and fertilized so that they can make seed and continue. And I just think that's kind of a nice reality check, that it's not about us. We're just lucky that we can appreciate that. Then it's very fun to think about how the plants can be used for us, for people. Back to our human-centric idea here. Purple coneflower is wonderful as a cut flower, as a pollinator plant. It also can be used, different parts of the plant can be used to make a tincture, which is used for boosting the immunity, as echinacea. Echinacea purpurea and also Echinacea angustifolia are two native species that are commonly used for that purpose. And then so several years ago, we had an event where we were highlighting edible native plants, and the cafe did a special for us. The salad that you see on the upper right was featuring 3 different native plant species. One of them is the pink vinaigrette. That's a prickly pear vinaigrette that they use on the salad. There's also purslane, which there are native and non-native purslanes, but if you've ever eaten those, they have a nice kind of citrusy flavor. You can pickle them or eat them fresh or cook them if you'd like, and they're very nutritious. And then it's topped also then with pecans from, Texas pecan. Pecan trees are the state tree of Texas. Going below that, you'll see a handful of the Texas persimmons, which I think is about one of my favorite wild foraging fruits. They're super delicious, rich, custardy kind of when you eat them, super fun. And if you put them in your mouth and you don't really clean your teeth and you smile at your friend, you got all the black stuff in your teeth, charming. And then clockwise next to that, there are the green pods of, anybody know what that is? Devil's claw. They're not fully mature. You want to harvest them when they're still green and tender. But the immature pods of the devil's claw, you can use just like you do okra. They're a little bit mucilaginous like okra, so it can be used as a thickener. If you pickle them, that mucilaginous stuff kind of goes away. They get kind of crispy like an okra does if you pickle them. And in this picture, we are making them, using a pickle recipe with the garlic and dill, and then the little red chili peppers is the native chili piquin, which really pack a punch, delicious. And then on the upper left picture, you have some prickly pear syrup, simple syrup that we made out of the prickly pears, and we're making margaritas. Was that you, Manette? That's your handwriting. Okay, then moving on. So if you're looking at the book, the bulk of the book is going to be like entries of each different species of different categories here. And there are 225 plus. That's what I was supposed to do, was 225 species, but a few snuck in when I wasn't looking because I can't help myself. And they're spanning across the whole state. So if you're gardening in Houston or you're gardening in Big Bend or the Panhandle, wherever, there are plants that will do well in your garden there. And then it's broken down into 7 categories, which I'll give you an example from each of those categories here in a moment. And then each entry, well, let me just add too that I tried to focus on species that were mostly available commercially because I don't want to frustrate people, but there are a few things that are less commonly used in gardens because I also want to, inspire gardeners to use, stretch and use some things that maybe you can't just buy at the nursery, maybe get people excited to ask for them at the nurseries, and maybe we'll have more species available. And what's great about y'all and this, Native Plant Society is that there's a lot of seed swapping and plant swapping and, things that you can't get very easily. So I think y'all will probably have an easier time of getting some of these things too. Then each entry will cover just your basic horticulture information. This is what it might look like. So, each plant entry talks about the bloom period, what the flowers look like, how big the plant gets, what kind of sun, moisture, soil types, that kind of thing. The basic how to grow plants, and also maintenance tips. Every entry has maintenance tips. Every entry also talks about what wildlife are attracted or served by that species. And how to take care of the plant, the gardening part of it, and then just another, couple sentences of just other information that might be kind of interesting. So one of the things that I added too that was really important was to not just give range information, but also habitat information. And I think that helps you really understand better how to use the plants in your landscape. And I talk about that a fair amount in the introduction section of the book. So I would like to share with you then just a few examples of some of the plants that are in the book. So woolly stomodia. This is a plant that you find in South Texas. It's a creeping ground cover. This is the ground cover section. Little tiny purple flowers, which are easy to miss unless you're looking at them up close. When the plant's in full bloom, you don't really see the flowers unless you're up close, but the whole plant turns like a silvery blue as opposed to just a silver. But it's a very pretty plant, and the flowers are catered to small butterflies and moths primarily, sometimes bees and other things too. But that's you might not think of it as being a good pollinator plant because it's a small flower, but it's good for that. It's a good plant if you have deer. Deer generally don't mess with it, and it roots at the nodes. So if they nibble on it and pull up pieces of it, the roots are still feeding the rest of the plant, so it can resprout and continue to make a nice mat forming plant. I recommend this a lot for people who want something like silver ponyfoot, which is a very common, popular plant. But my experience with the silver ponyfoot is that it's a little more temperamental. We've lost them over the wintertime, particularly if we have a wet winter. They don't like that. So the woolly stomodia seems to be much more reliable than the silver ponyfoot. And you can use it in lots of the same ways. It's just a beautiful silver ground cover. It does great in a hanging basket. This is from the book. Soft silvery fingers drop roots to the ground from each node. It calls for a double take, rambling across gravel mulch or dribbling over the lip of a pot or a wall. It's very heat tolerant. It's ever gray. Unless you have it in a pretty exposed spot, then it might be turn black in the wintertime when we get a freeze. But okay, moving on. The next section involves herbaceous species. And I don't have a lot of ferns in the book, unfortunately, because they're really hard to find commercially. Although one of the things that we've been working on at the Wildflower Center is to have more ferns available for our plant sales and also to add to our gardens. So keep an eye out for more ferns moving into the future. This is maidenhair fern. Let me just add another thing about ferns, which I just think is mind-blowing for a lot of folks. This is going to sound like a trick question. So what part of the state do you think you would find the most ferns? It kind of is a trick question. Do you think you'd find more ferns in East Texas or in West Texas?
West Texas.
That's a trick question, because West Texas has more species. There's more speciation that occurs in harsher environments like the desert. So you have more species, but if you look at East Texas, you might have fewer species, but probably a lot more biomass because there's just more of them, more plant. So, and then in the central part of the state, kind of intermediate, but a lot of people don't think of ferns growing in the desert. And if you've been as close as, Enchanted Rock, you'll see ferns growing at the base of the prickly pear, right? And that blows people's minds. If you're from the East Coast or something, that just doesn't compute. Anyway, so maidenhair fern. This is a deciduous perennial that gets about a foot, maybe a foot and a half tall, depending on the conditions. It spreads slowly by rhizomes, so it can, if you have it tucked into little cracks along a pond or something, it'll just fill in those gaps, which is nice. They're mostly shade loving, but they'll tolerate a little bit of sun if they get a little bit of extra water, but really a shade plant. So I tried to make sure that we get a good amount of shade species in there as well. Ferns generally are deer resistant. Nothing is deer proof. I don't say that. Nothing is deer proof unless it's plastic or silk. But they do generally leave the maidenhair ferns and other ferns alone. Maidenhair grows from the Edwards Plateau all the way into West Texas in the Big Bend region, in shady, moist areas. So any rock-rimmed pond appears lusher, greener, and maybe even wetter with the emerald green lacy leaves and contrasting black stems of the maidenhair fern sprouting from crannies between the stones. And the black stems are one of the neat features of it because it really makes the green foliage pop out. This you might recognize as basket grass or bear grass, the Nolina texana, which is not a grass at all. It's in the lily family. We call them woody lilies. But they look like a grass, and so they are stuck in the grass and grass-like plant section of the book. What's nice is that they are evergreen, so you can plant them somewhere and they look like that all the time. The drawback is that they're kind of slow growing, but I think that's worth it. They're also extremely drought tolerant. If you're gardening with them in Central Texas, you get them established and then you don't have to water them after that. They are just fine. But it's a little hard to find them. Sometimes you can find its sibling, the Nolina lindheimeriana, which is called devil's shoestring because the leaves are very sharp and serrated on the edges, kind of like a pampas grass. So if you're handling that one, be careful. This one I prefer because of that issue. The leaves are very smooth and leathery, and they're not going to cut you. And the form is a little bit slightly different, also, but it's also very elegant. What else to say about it? It gets wider than it does tall. It only gets maybe 2 or 3 feet tall. The flowers bloom in the foliage, but I've seen the plant spreading, those long leaves can spread 6 feet wide. So it can take up some space. It's also nice because it'll tolerate full sun to full shade. You typically see it in dry shade. Like in Austin, you see it, in Westlake and the western part of the city. And then those little creamy white flowers are wonderful for attracting little tiny pollinators, the little bees and flies. So that's a lot of fun to see what comes to them when they're blooming, usually around April. This is another plant that's also fairly deer resistant. The stout flower clusters cloister in the foliage, barely emerging above the fluid arching waves of leaves. Pour them over boulders or a wall. In grand swaths, it's graceful, firm, and confident. A pair in pots make a veritable welcome committee, flanking a lightly shaded front door. Hello. Oh, the beautiful claret cup. So there's another section on cacti and succulents, and so the claret cup cactus is part of that group. beautiful, showy, kind of reddish orange flowers that are that color is very saturated. They're about 2 inches in diameter, blooming in early to mid spring, maybe late spring, particularly if we have some rain. You see this plant growing in Central Texas and into the Trans-Pecos. Um, You'll see it growing in full sun to maybe a little bit of shade. Light woodlands is fine. Alluvial banks and grasslands in those different areas. It's really good for attracting bees and even hummingbirds. You don't think of hummingbirds going to cacti, but they'll go to that as well. And then the fruits are really good for feeding small mammals. So that's kind of another benefit. My maintenance tip on this one is that plants appreciate periodic blown kisses. Just don't pepper up too closely. That's your maintenance, y'all. um, in the ground, more stems occur in shallow soils and dry, rocky conditions. You'll have more stems. And while in the deeper soils, they'll produce fewer but larger stems. Rare among cacti, the plants are dioecious, meaning that male and female flowers occur on separate plants, with only the female plants bearing fruit. And they're actually fairly complicated in their biology that way. So that's kind of interesting. All right, Flamacanthus, hummingbird bush, very aptly named. I love this plant because it blooms in the middle of summer when a lot of other things just don't wanna. And, it gets about 3 to 4 feet tall, generally speaking. Full sun, light shade is fine. And they don't bloom until later in the summer. So that allows you a little bit of time in the spring to do a little shaping, particularly if we have a lot of rain, they'll grow really fast and they won't be, I mean, you don't have to trim them, but if you want them to look a little bit more shaped, less rangy, just doing a little bit of light tipping periodically and then leave it alone probably like in May, stop trimming it, and then it'll have a nice shape. And then we might do a little bit of light trimming throughout the rest of the season, but leaving it alone mostly works pretty well. They're excellent. Based on the name, you might suppose that it's an excellent plant for attracting hummingbirds, but also some of the larger butterflies. And I say larger butterflies because they have to be large enough to have a proboscis that's long enough to get into the tubes of the flowers. So that's important. And then aflame with flowers through the punishing months of summer when little else is willing, Flamacanthus flushes lushly after rains while feisty territorial hummingbirds orbit plants for hours. Hailing from far south Texas, the plants grow easily under cultivation throughout the state. Oh, I'm going to say these are all my favorite plants, but there are more. There are always more favorite plants. Southern magnolia. So a large tree that grows in the eastern part of the state. They can get, depending on the conditions, even up to 75 feet tall, 30 feet wide. These get to be pretty good sized trees. Generally, you need to have deeper soils to accommodate for that. When I've seen them growing on rockier or thinner soils where people try to grow them like in Austin, they just get a little stunted. They tend to be a little bit less lush and a little bit yellow sometimes, particularly if they're not irrigated. So those are drawbacks. They are typically thought to grow in acidic soils, but I've seen them growing in calcareous soils as well, and that's fine. One of the best things is when these things are blooming, they just smell incredible. So like late spring, mid to late spring. So it doesn't get more southern than magnolia. A heady fragrance exudes from the salad plate sized blossoms, sliding us from sprightly spring into the languid days of summer. Cream colored flowers appear to hover against the dark green, glistening leaves. Glimpsing the leaves' undersides, you'll find a rich, russet wool. Dense shade, surface roots, and leathery leaf litter that smothers underplantings lead many gardeners to give up completely and simply lay down mulch. Don't. Okay, Mustang grape. Again, this is not necessarily a plant that just your average gardener wants to plant, but you might have a location where this is going to be just fabulous. And there are male and female plants. So if you're looking for the fruit, you want to get a female plant, which is hard to know until they start to bloom and you actually can look at the flowers. So if you're growing them from seed, It might take a little bit, a year or so before you know. If you don't want the fruit because they're kind of messy, then a male plant might be more suited for you because they're wonderful for providing shade. If you have an arbor over a carport, for example, I have grapes that are growing in the trees above where we park our cars at our house, but unfortunately, they're all female trees. So there's a huge mess every summer on our plants. I mean, on our cars. There are also a lot of really useful things that this plant provides. You can use the stems, which are very supple, to weave into, I don't know, some kind of trellis or a screen. You can eat the tender new growth, the leaves in the spring. What I like to do with them, we'll wrap them around pieces of chicken and put them on the grill. And the flavor of the leaves has kind of a citrusy flavor to them, and it imparts some of that flavor into the chicken, and then the chicken kind of gets all the juices cooking inside. They're really delicious. And when you chew on them, if they're not super tender, because you can kind of lean a little bit into a little bit of fibrous, then they become like everlasting gum. We call it like the Mustang grape chewing gum, because you just chew on it forever and it never goes away until you just decide you're going to spit it out. Which is really good when you're doing that around the fire. And then, of course, the grapes are delicious. The ripe blue, purple fruits are really great for making grape juice that kind of tastes like a Concord grape flavor. Preferably you'll let the oxalic acid crystallize out of it and then pour off the top and appreciate that. Maybe mix a lot of sugar in with it because they can be tart. But yeah, they're really delicious that way. And then you can use the green immature fruits to make green grape pie, or one of our colleagues at the Wildflower Center has a family recipe for like grape olives where they're brined and they're really delicious, but you harvest them when they're still small and tender before the seeds get crunchy. So these plants will take over. If you have trees and you want them to live and be healthy, you probably want to pull the grapevines off of them. But if it's a healthy tree and you're wanting shade, then that might be a good thing to leave them growing. They bloom in the spring, like around April, and most people don't notice it because they're really tiny flowers. I notice it because they fall all over the car. But what's nicer than having little flower petals all over your car when you come out in the morning? And they're fragrant. I hadn't realized that, but they really smell good when they're blooming. So that's a nice little benefit too. Let's see. Vigorous tendrilled vines lend dense shade quickly. Falling grapes may create a nuisance, but only the female plants produce fruit. True. Unripe fruits make a mouth-watering green grape pie, while mature grapes cook down to a flavorful inky purple syrup, suitable for a slew of recipes. Try it over vanilla ice cream. It's as dazzling as it is tasty because that rich purple, saturated purple color is really beautiful. The grape skins contain the irritating oxalic acid. So wear gloves when you're handling them. If you're harvesting a lot of grapes, your fingers might start to not feel very good. So gloves is good. To avoid mouth burn, you can either process them before you consume them, or for a treat in the field, just squeeze the pulp out into your mouth and discard the skins. That's the way I enjoy them in the field mostly. One of the ways you can tell the Mustang grapes from other species is to look on the undersides of the leaves. They have a kind of a dense white felt to them underneath the leaves. And if it doesn't have that, then it's a different species. One of the tricky things about the Mustang grapes too, if you're trying to identify them just from the foliage, is that they're very dimorphic. Some of the foliage is more heart-shaped or kind of cupped, like what most of that you see in there. And then kind of right in the middle, you'll see where a few of the leaves are more lobed. And sometimes they're very lobed and look extremely different. And they'll be on the same plant even. So that makes it tricky. Okay. So I'm really, as I said, I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to highlight some of these wonderful standard workhorses in the garden, but then also with luck to pique some interest in trying some of the lesser known of the bunch. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important for us to ask for these plants when we're in the local garden centers and see if we can get folks to grow them more and have them be more available. I've been really disheartened over the last few years that many of the nurseries that I've relied on to supply native plants have gone out of business for various reasons. And there are some new ones coming on too, and I'm hopeful that they'll be successful. So, go to your local garden centers and give them some business. So, if we're asking for them, hopefully we'll get more of those species available in the trade. In the meantime, doing plant swaps, trading plants with your buddies, those sort of things are going to be really wonderful. The Native Plant Society is a wonderful resource for getting a lot of those hard to find plants. Of course, our native plant sales at the Wildflower Center is an excellent place to find hard to find things in particular. Anyway, I hope that if you're looking at the book, that can be very helpful for you to learn more about how to be successful as a gardener. I tried to make it as fun as it is educational. So that's what I have for you. I think that's my last slide. Oh yeah, what is that? What kind of plant blooms? So that's an aster flower. I think that's from the heath aster on a skeleton of prickly pear skeleton. Isn't that cool? We have a couple volunteers that have been working with the Wildflower Center for years. And between the two of them, they've taken a lot of the pictures that are in the book. Bruce Leander did a lot of the plant images, and I think almost all of the animal images are from Bill Boyd. So anyway, and I have to say, like almost all the pictures, I took a few of them, but most of these are from our native plant information database. So a lot of people, over time have contributed to, having different plants in the book or different pictures in the book. I have a really great picture of an agave from you there, so you'll have to check that out. Any questions? How are we doing on time?
You mentioned Joe Pye. I have tried that a couple of times because they always mention it. And I've gotten it through the summer, but it's never come back. Is that the typical experience, or am I doing something wrong?
I actually don't have a lot of experience with Joe Pyeweed, which is what the question was about. Maybe somebody in here has used Joe Pyeweed, whether you've been successful or not. I know it doesn't grow wild here, so I don't know if it's not wet enough or what the limiting factor is.
It's fine, but it just hasn't come.
Yeah.
Twice.
Yes.
I was reading an article just a couple of days ago about prairie pussyfoot. Have you ever heard of that? Now, the normal pussyfoot is a northern plant. It's a Yankee plant.
Like a pussy willow?
I mean, really, it's a ground cover. It's about 6 inches tall, puts out beautiful little white flowers in the springtime. But they were talking about it being the prairie pussyfoot is all over Texas. They had a map of a shaded map of where it grows, and all of Texas was in it, which really surprised me because I never heard about it before. Have you ever heard of it?
So the question was about pussyfoot and its range, and that where did you see that it was all over Texas?
It was a map. It was a horticultural map of that particular plant showing the range.
Right.
And most of the plants were up in Minnesota and North Dakota and that area, cold weather. But the prairie was kind of a lower Midwest to southern, and it included Texas. But I was talking to some of our like Dee Dee, our one of our most experienced native plant. She looked at me like I was an idiot. You made that up. You didn't make that up. Yeah.
Well, okay. So the question is, if I've been familiar with that plant, and I don't know it by that common name, pussyfoot, but I do know pussy toes, which there are plants that grow throughout the state, and they're different species.
It looks like a little kitten's foot,
So there's like, I get the Evax and what was that? The Antenaria, yeah. And I think some of those actually even smell like maple syrup if you ever crush the leaves. Anyway, they're different species, and so they're made. You what?
I'd roll in that.
You'd roll in that. Anybody else have any experience with that? Yes.
I grew up in and we had the pussy willows all the time.
Well, and the pussy willow is different. That's a tree.
That's a tree.
Yeah.
Whatever.
This is a little.
It's like a willow and the,
Pussy willow, whatever.
yeah, yeah. Any other questions or comments? I meant to say Eric did this beautiful picture that I was talking about the agave because it was covered with snow, and that picture's in the book, and I love that shot of the agave.
Well, it looks like I'm gonna be the only one in Texas that has one.
Lucky.
Any other questions or comments?
We spoke at the symposium here last fall. We were talking about the time sharing, so I thought I'm gonna try it with Heartleaf Skullcap and Salvia Coccidia. And it's kind of working, and then I have some Inlanceos in the same areas. It's not Wildflower Center worthy, but
Combination.
it's working. No, so they're sharing the same bed and they have their different moments.
So you have those three?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so if you didn't hear that, she's experimenting with the time sharing idea with the heartleaf skullcap, scarlet sage, and the inland sea oats. And I will say that the heartleaf skullcap is a little bit tricky because it's a cool season plant, but it doesn't finish up until kind of late in the season, and so it's a little hard to match with some of the warm season that would already be pretty full and flesh with that.
Salvia Coccidia, it's pretty shady there, so it doesn't really start blooming until later.
Mhm.
Yeah, whereas if it were in the sunnier area.
Yeah, and that combination, the heartleaf skullcap with the scarlet sage, that's one that we've done also because it can be a little, well, yeah, I mean, you can experiment and just try them out. Yeah. And people ask me all the time, well, what's some other combinations? And, it's endless. You can do, a lot of the spring blooming annuals are great because they go away in the summer and then you can have your warm season things. So basically just trying to match up the warm season and cool season, but the heartleaf skullcap is a tricky one. So yeah, I've been trying to work with that too. I don't have books for sale because we're part of the University of Texas and they don't allow me to sell with credit cards because it's an IT security issue. So if you are at the Wildflower Center in Austin, come by the Wildflower Center and get your books there. Members get 10% off all the time, which is great. You can also scan the QR code here and that'll take you to Timber Press directly and you can order them directly from Timber Press as well. And I'm happy to keep answering any questions. I'll stick around as long as people are interested in engaging. If you want me to sign a book, I'm happy to do that.
If you want to use that table.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Are your plant sales pinned down to a certain week on fall, spring, and what are?
Yeah, so the question about when our plant sales are, so what we've been doing is, well, I'm not going to promise it's going to stay this way because I'm not the director of horticulture anymore, so I'm not making the decisions. But what it's been for the last couple of years is 5 weekends, 5 weekends in the spring and 5 in the fall. So it would be the month of April. All of those weekends would be open to the public. Actually, I take that back. What we did this last time is we had the last weekend of March and then the whole month of April, those weekends. Fridays were for members only, and then the weekends were for the general public. Because the way we're restocking is bringing plants from our own nursery, but also supplying it with plants that we get from outside vendors. So Friday is when we actually have the best selection, and then it winnows down over the weekend. So last of March, and then through the month of April, and then in the fall, it would be the last weekend of September and the month of October. So, like I said, though, that could change. We'll see what the new director of horticulture is going to want to do. All right.
I think a lot of people have books for you to sign. So if you want to use that table over here and take a chair so you can sit. Two other things I need to tell you. We do need to fold up the chairs. There are a couple of racks that Katie will put out to put the chairs on. The other thing is the lighting when you leave. It's not good. If you have a flashlight on your phone, use it. If you don't have one, let me know. We'll get somebody to escort you Because we want to be sure nobody falls on the way. Thank you.
Who's the keeper of this box? Oh, okay, yeah, she created it just for this. Oh, okay. Okay. That's her what she must have.
Sorry, I jumped in there at the end.
Oh, it's like, I started to go up and say, we had some guests here tonight, and I was gonna say thank you to the guests who attended this evening. That's absolutely fine. Totally fine. I'm confused right now. I fixed myself a cup of tea. I have no idea where I put it. I never took a sip.
You're fine, you're fine. You know, they, okay. And that's one of the reasons I did. Yeah. Now.
The television.
It's right here.
Oh, okay.
And we will. But you're not together. No, there. So it's my. Yeah.